To men who have experienced unwanted encounters with women, what's your experience? Story 1. When I was 13, she was a neighbor and a family friend who lived near us on a military base. She would often hire me to do chores around her house whenever her husband was away. I mowed her lawn weekly and helped with other tasks. Over time, she started giving me gifts and taking me on trips around town. My parents didn't think much of it, but as time passed, she began to manipulate me almost every day. When her husband returned home, I was suddenly ignored. I don't know what was said to my parents, but at 14, I was kicked out of my home and sent to live with my grandmother. It wasn't the fun or exciting experience that many might imagine. It destroyed me. I felt disconnected from everyone, especially from girls my own age, and it made me ashamed of myself. To this day, I struggle to trust people, even family members and romantic partners. Story 2. When I was 7, I would spend my summer days at my friend's house. His older sister, who was around 11, would watch over us. This was back in the 80s, so we were all latchkey kids. One day, she put on a VHS tape that was not suitable for kids. My friend was uncomfortable, but I was curious. She made a comment about how interested I seemed in the man in the movie and joked that she and her dad watched it all the time. Over the course of the summer, things took a darker turn as she started acting in ways that were inappropriate. This continued throughout the summer until, tragically, both she and my friend died in a car accident that fall. For the next decade, I found it incredibly hard to form close connections or be intimate with anyone. Story 3. It all started like any other night out, having drinks with a friend. We ended up meeting some new people, including a girl who was a friend of a friend. She wasn't drinking that night and offered to give us a ride home when we were ready to leave, which seemed like a great idea compared to paying for a ride. I drank too much, and what happened next is based on what my friend told me afterward. As the night was winding down, the girl driving asked my friend where she lived. My friend explained that she was supposed to stay at my place as planned. The girl insisted that we go somewhere else, leading to a tense exchange. My friend mentioned that her keys and belongings were at my place, but the girl demanded an address or threatened to drop us off immediately. I was passed out in the back seat, completely unresponsive. My friend eventually gave her an address where she could get in, and she tried contacting my roommates, but no one answered. When I woke up the next morning, I was alone, confused, and disoriented. Story 4. I was a freshman in college when my roommate and a few friends were heading to a sorority date event. It's one of those parties where you need to be invited by a member of the sorority, and each member can only bring one date. I knew a couple of girls in the sorority and asked if anyone needed a date. I was set up with someone I hadn't met before. I checked her out on social media, and although she wasn't really my type, I was just happy to have an invite. We hosted a pregame at my dorm with about 10 others joining us before the event. She arrived late, and by then, I was already drinking with my friends. I offered her a drink, but she said she was sticking to water that night, which was fine by me. However, she didn't seem interested in talking to anyone, even people she already knew, which gave me a strange feeling. As the night went on, I was about a 7 or 8 out of 10 in terms of drunkenness. Not out of control, but definitely feeling it. We knew we couldn't drink at the venue, so most of us planned to drink beforehand. Just as I was about to leave, she suddenly asked for a shot. It seemed odd that she wanted to drink now, but I thought maybe she had changed her mind. She poured 2 shots, one for me, which was very full, and one for herself, barely half full. She handed me the full shot and said, "Cheers." Despite my better judgment, I took it. She poured another round, and I took the second shot, too, knowing I probably shouldn't have. I was now on the edge of blacking out while she remained mostly sober. At the event, I vaguely remember her dancing and getting too close to me, which made me uncomfortable. I apologized for being too drunk and told her I was going home, suggesting she stay and enjoy the night with her friends. But she insisted on walking me back to my dorm, saying she was ready to leave too. Once we got back to my place, I just wanted to crash, but she wouldn't let me go to my room, claiming my roommate was planning to hook up with someone there. She even took my keys and said I had to stay in her room. I was too drunk to argue, so I followed her. When we got to her room, I just wanted to sleep, so I crashed on her bed. At some point, I woke up to her trying to do something I wasn't comfortable with. I was barely aware of what was happening, but I managed to push her off and move to her roommate's bed to sleep. Early the next morning, I found my keys, snuck out, and went back to my room. My roommate wasn't even there. He had gone to his date's place, so everything she said was a lie. Looking back, it's clear she deliberately got me too drunk to make any decisions. I feel fortunate that I was able to physically get out of that situation, and it made me realize how difficult it must be for others who aren't able to escape. Story 5. When I was younger, I had an experience at a party that still sticks with me. I was drinking, and there was a girl there who had previously tried to get close to me, but I wasn't interested because she wasn't my type. We were hanging out, and I remember bits and pieces of being in a car with her. At one point, I woke up in my own car, feeling confused, because I knew I hadn't had more than 4 or 5 drinks. I had been trying to pace myself since I planned on driving home later. I found out later that, at some point during the night, she had given me a drink that was tampered with. There was something added to it that I didn't know about. Some of our mutual friends thought it was a joke, but I didn't see the humor in it at all. It took me a long time to come to terms with what happened. This was back in 2005, and unfortunately, situations like this weren't taken as seriously as they are today, at least not where I was living at the time. To make matters worse, the girl kept contacting me afterward, even making up stories to get my attention, including a false claim that she was pregnant just to keep me talking to her. The conversation ended when she admitted she was lying and just wanted to make sure I was okay. Now, I'm in a much better place. I have a wonderful wife and a fulfilling career, and I've moved past that difficult time. I was honestly surprised and comforted to hear from others who had been through similar situations. It made me feel less alone. Story 6. I have a friend who happens to be gay. He's smart, fun to be around, and generally considered very good-looking. He's on the shorter side, about 54 or 55, although I think he sometimes wears lifts. Despite his height, he has such a big personality that you barely notice. One thing I only recently picked up on, though, is that he seems nervous around women, especially if they're taller or have a bigger build than he does. I asked him about it a few times, and he always brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. Eventually, he opened up to me and shared something that had happened to him. He confided that he had been in a difficult situation at a party where a woman had taken advantage of him. She was taller and heavier, and with the help of a friend, they made him feel trapped and powerless. He had gone upstairs during the party, and that's where the incident occurred. When I asked him why he never reported it to the authorities, he said he didn't think they would take him seriously. From what I understand, he may have tried seeking support from the crisis center at his college, but it seems they didn't offer the help he needed. The experience clearly left a mark on him, and it explains why he feels uncomfortable around certain women. He doesn't really talk about it much, and I only learned about it because I pressed him on the issue. It's heartbreaking to think about what he went through and how it continues to affect his life. Story 7. When I was around 18 or 20 years old, I was still living with my parents. They went away for the weekend, so I planned to spend the time playing games and having some drinks. On Friday evening, a woman in her 40s who was renting an apartment from our neighbors texted me, asking if I wanted to watch a movie. We chatted a few times when we ran into each other outside, so I thought it might be nice to have some company. She came over and brought wine. As we watched the movie, I gradually got more and more drunk. Every time I came back from the bathroom, my glass was filled to the brim. Eventually, I was completely intoxicated, and suddenly, we were both in the bathtub without our clothes on. I can't remember if anything happened there, but the next thing I knew, I was in my bed, still undressed, with her sitting on the side. I remember mumbling something like, "I think it's time for you to go home." But she put her hand under the blanket and asked, "Do I really have to leave already?" She then undressed and got on top of me while I felt like I was having some kind of out-of-body experience. I barely remember moving or feeling anything, except the room spinning around me. Afterward, she gave me a quick kiss and left. It wasn't until years later, when I wrote about it in an online thread, that I fully realized how uncomfortable and wrong that situation actually was. Story 8. I had a date that ended with us going back to her place to watch movies, smoke some weed, and have a few drinks. To this day, she was one of the most beautiful women I'd ever met, and I didn't want to rush anything. I remember having just one drink, but suddenly, I felt extremely lightheaded and everything became blurry. I only remember coming to for a moment, with her on top of me, and then I passed out again. The next day, she acted like everything was great and told me she was happy about what happened. I didn't respond to her after that and immediately went to get tested for any health concerns. Thankfully, everything came back clear and she wasn't pregnant, so I was relieved. But the fact remains, I definitely did not consent to any of it. Story 9. My junior year of college, I went to a party at a different school and ended up getting blackout drunk. I was a 210-pound rugby player and powerlifter, so I thought I could handle my alcohol. I had been drinking heavily all day when we arrived at a friend's place, and I was already fading in and out of consciousness. At some point, a girl helped carry me to her place while I was barely awake. Later, I learned that she had practically dragged me, a 200-pound guy, almost a mile back to her place. When I woke up the next morning, I was disoriented. I had my shirt on, but no pants or shoes, and there were signs that something had happened that I couldn't fully remember. I was in a relationship at the time, and I felt terrible about the situation, especially since others at the party thought it was funny, and even took pictures. I couldn't bring myself to tell my girlfriend, because I didn't think anyone would believe my story. It was disheartening to see how often situations like this get brushed off, particularly when it happens to guys. Story 10. I told my wife, now ex-wife, that I wanted a divorce. Emotionally, I was done with the marriage, but neither of us was in a financial position to move out, so we continued living together. She didn't want the kids to know about our separation yet, so instead of me sleeping on the couch, we continued to share a bed. I made it very clear that while I was okay with sharing a bed, I didn't want any kind of physical relationship with her anymore. This arrangement went on for several weeks. At the time, I was struggling with depression and was taking a combination of Tylenol PM, Benadryl, and NyQuil every night to help me sleep. One night, I took about 15 Tylenol PMs and Benadryl, followed by some NyQuil. I nearly passed out in the shower, but managed to get into bed completely out of it. The next morning, I woke up to her talking about how great last night was. I was confused because I didn't remember anything. She then told me that we had been intimate the night before. She said she asked if it was okay, and that since I didn't say no, she went ahead. I didn't say no because I was barely conscious. I wasn't speaking or even aware of what was happening. I reminded her that I had already told her I didn't want that kind of relationship anymore, but she brushed it off, saying that it wasn't a big deal because we were married and that I enjoyed it, so it shouldn't matter. Not long after that incident, I hit a low point and ended up attempting suicide. Not necessarily because of that specific event, but it certainly contributed to my state of mind. After being released from the hospital, I left for good. I confided in a few friends, telling them that I thought what had happened was wrong, and they agreed that my boundaries had been violated. During one argument with my ex over text while going through the divorce, I brought up what had happened. She dismissed it, saying I was exaggerating and that it wasn't a violation, accusing me of making light of real victims' experiences. Story 11. When I was about 18, in my first year of university, I was getting ready to go out to a bar with a group of friends. Like many students, we were pre-drinking to save some money, and I ended up drinking way too much, finishing off a bottle of J.G.R. by myself. I completely blacked out before we even left to go out. The next thing I remember is waking up around 4 a.m., finding myself in a random dorm room with someone on top of me. As my vision cleared, I realized it was a very close friend of mine from our group. Up until that point, we were just good friends, with no signs of anything romantic or physical between us. When I woke up and seemed confused, She quickly got off me, covered herself, and suggested that I leave. The way she reacted made me feel like I had done something wrong, even though I didn't understand what had just happened. I stumbled back to my own room, still dazed and unsure of what had taken place. Even though I know I didn't consent and couldn't have in that state, I feel conflicted about the whole situation. It's strange because I don't feel deeply hurt by it. Instead, I just feel very neutral and confused about what it means. Story 12. It was a Halloween party after college, and I ended up getting way too drunk, eventually passing out on a table. We were at that one friend's house that always seemed like the perfect spot for a never-ending party. I hadn't seen this friend since college, so aside from a few familiar faces, there were lots of people I didn't know. Since I had a decent job by then, I bought a lot of the alcohol and drank more than my fair share. It must have been around 3 o'clock or 4 a.m. when I started to become aware of what was happening. I was still very intoxicated to the point where I probably couldn't stand if I tried. I felt hands on my chest, gently massaging me, and as I started to come to, I realized someone had been touching me for a while. I tried to roll over, but whoever it was rolled me back onto my back. Then I felt someone begin to unzip my pants. I was still groggy and couldn't fully comprehend what was happening, but I mumbled something like, "No, I'm too drunk." I remember feeling a sense of panic when someone ignored my words and continued. I felt them climb on top of me, and I tried to push them off, but I was too out of it to resist effectively. I heard a voice say, "It's okay, I'm going to take care of everything," and from that, I realized it was a woman. She continued despite my attempts to get her to stop. I was aware we weren't using any protection, and I was trying to resist, but I kept drifting in and out of consciousness. After she finished, she left me there without even covering me up or pulling my pants back up. The next morning, I woke up alone, still in shock over what had happened. It was a confusing and disorienting experience that I still struggle to make sense of. Story 13. This story is about my wife's friend. He was at a party where a girl seemed to be following him around all night. He tried to enjoy the party and had quite a bit to drink. When he was ready to call it a night, he decided to crash in a friend's bed. He woke up around 4 o'clock in the morning to find the same girl from earlier on top of him. He immediately pushed her off and caused a commotion that woke up the entire house. Without hesitation, he called the police, and while they were waiting, she stood there laughing as if it were all a joke. When the police arrived, the girl claimed that he had assaulted her. What she didn't realize was that he is openly gay, and everyone at the party knew it. The whole house confirmed that he was not interested in women. As a result, she was arrested. Unfortunately, it turned out that she became pregnant. She ended up serving time, and when the child was born, he took full custody of his son. It's been 9 years now, and he continues to raise his son with love and care while also receiving child support from her. Story 14. When I was 8 years old, I went through a very difficult time. I was mistreated and hurt by my older stepsister, who was about 15 or 16 at the time, and this went on for nearly a year. During that year, I tried to tell my mom and stepdad about what was happening, but they didn't believe me. They even laughed it off, acting like it was nothing, which made the experience even more painful and isolating. One night, while we were staying at my great-grandma's house, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I woke her up in the middle of the night, crying and telling her everything I was going through. She was the first person who actually believed me and took my situation seriously. Thanks to her, my stepsister was held accountable for her actions and ended up being placed in juvenile detention for about 8 months. After she was released, my great-grandma and great-grandpa took me in and raised me, giving me a safer environment to grow up in. My relationship with my mom is still strained because of everything that happened and the way she responded when I needed her most. It took years of therapy and a lot of support to work through the pain and trauma of those experiences. Now, at 22, I'm in a much better place, but it was a long journey to get here. Story 15. At the time, I was devoutly Mormon, dating a girlfriend who wasn't. She wanted to take our relationship to the next level, but I wasn't ready. I believed in waiting until marriage. As things progressed, she began saying things like, "If you loved me, you would do this for me," making me feel guilty for not wanting to go further. One day, while we were making out, things escalated quickly. Before I could fully process or stop what was happening, it was already too late. When it was over, I felt completely overwhelmed and walked out of the room. The rest of the day was unbearable. I didn't want to be near her or even be alone with my own thoughts. I felt like I had let down my family, my church, and my beliefs. It took me a long time to process the guilt, and leaving the Mormon church eventually helped me gain perspective and heal. However, I still struggle with trust and intimacy due to that experience. Despite everything, I'm now grateful to have a wonderful partner who is understanding and has had a positive influence on my life. Story 16. When I was about 18, I lived on my own and had been talking to a girl online for years. We finally decided to meet in person. I had expectations based on what she had told me about her appearance, but when she showed up, she looked very different from what I had imagined. Despite my initial surprise, we still had a good conversation and got along well. I knew where things were headed, but I wasn't comfortable with it. I didn't want to cause any conflict, so I tried to go along with it. As the night went on, she made it clear she wanted to take things further. I tried to remind myself of our earlier conversations, but I eventually couldn't do it. I told her she deserved someone who genuinely appreciated her, and we agreed not to go through with it. I chose to sleep on the couch. Later that night, I woke up to find her on top of me. I told her no, but she didn't listen. I felt trapped, unsure of what to do, so I just waited for it to be over. Afterward, I was left with a deep sense of shame, guilt, and confusion. The memory of that night has stayed with me, even down to the smell of her perfume. Now, at 32 years old, married with 2 kids, I recently told my wife what happened for the first time. Sharing it has helped me realize I wasn't alone in how I felt. For a long time, I struggled with shame and confusion, but talking about it and understanding that others have gone through similar experiences has helped me make sense of what I went through. Thank you for letting me share my story. Story 17. When I was in college, around 21 or 22 years old, I had just started dating a girl who would later become my girlfriend for over 5 years. One night, I went out to a bar with a friend, and we had a couple of drinks while meeting some other people. We ran into a mutual friend from freshman year, a girl who had shown interest in me back then. She bought us drinks, and that's when my memory of the night starts to fade. I remember having only about 3 or 4 drinks over a few hours, which shouldn't have been enough to affect me, especially since I was used to drinking more. The next morning, I woke up to find her on top of me in my bed. In a panic, I pushed her off and onto the floor. I tried to be polite, asking her to leave and making sure she had a way to get home, even though I was feeling shocked and uncomfortable. I felt incredibly embarrassed as I walked her downstairs, worried my roommates might see what had happened. After she left, my roommate told me I had come home the night before in a state he found hilarious. He said I was barely able to walk, crawling up the stairs and stumbling into cabinets. I was upset that he thought it was funny, especially since he knew I was in a serious relationship with someone else. When I returned to my room, I noticed blood on the bed and some things broken on my nightstand. I had the worst hangover of my life, and I couldn't understand how I had gotten that way after only a few drinks. Later, it hit me that I might have been drugged, whether intentionally or accidentally. I immediately got tested and told my girlfriend what had happened. I was in tears, scared she might leave me because of it. That experience sent me into an emotional spiral, and it took a long time to recover. I'm incredibly grateful for my girlfriend at the time. She was supportive and understanding in a way I could have only hoped for. Even though it's been years, that night still affects me. I haven't shared it with anyone else besides her, and it continues to mess with my head, especially when it comes to trusting people in relationships. But knowing that someone was there for me during that difficult time made all the difference. Story 18. I was going through one of the toughest times of my life. As a single father, struggling financially, my social life was in shambles, and I was feeling extremely lonely. During that time, I had a good friend who was a coworker. He rented a room from a guy who fit the tough guy stereotype: diesel truck, loud parties, the whole deal. We would hang out at his place sometimes, and his girlfriend, who he didn't treat well at all, was someone I had a huge crush on. She was smart, successful, and beautiful. One night, I ended up getting really drunk at their place. That night, she and another woman took advantage of me while I was in that state. They pinned me down in the bathroom and removed my pants. I was drifting in and out of consciousness, so I don't remember everything clearly, but I know they didn't respect my boundaries. I remember trying to resist, but I wasn't able to stop them. Before that night, I thought she was absolutely amazing, but after what happened, I couldn't see her in the same light. She became someone I didn't want anything to do with anymore. I have no idea who the other girl was, but they seemed to work together as a team. Story 19. This experience still haunts me to this day. I have epilepsy and suffer from Tourette-induced tonic-clonic seizures. During these episodes, I remain conscious, but my body convulses uncontrollably, and the pain can be excruciating. I was engaged at the time, and one night, while sitting in bed, I started having an episode. My arms and legs began to jerk, and a splitting pain coursed through my head. To my shock, my fiancé, he seemed to become excited by my condition and started touching me inappropriately, trying to get a reaction from me. When I asked her what she was doing, she just said she had been waiting for this moment. I asked her to stop, but she didn't listen. I was in immense pain, my head thrashing against the headboard, and I was too weak to fight back. Despite my protests and attempts to push her off, she just brushed my arms aside, laughing as she did so. I felt completely powerless, trapped in my own body, while someone I loved disregarded my pain and suffering for her own pleasure. Afterward, I was left in bed, unable to move or leave, feeling utterly broken. She even laughed at my tears, telling me to stop crying. Despite what happened, I went through with the wedding plan for the following Thursday, a decision that still fills me with shame. Thankfully, the marriage didn't last long, and I divorced her within a few months. Even though I moved on, I can never forget or forgive her for what she did. It's a memory I still struggle to come to terms with. Story 20. At the time, I was struggling with mental health issues, low self-confidence, and major depression. I was at one of the lowest points of my life when I started dating a girl who seemed great. She was supportive and understanding of my struggles, but I didn't want to rely on her too much, so I made sure I wasn't dependent on her, even though she helped me a lot. At first, our relationship was going well, including the physical side of things. But after a couple of months, something in her changed. She became very demanding about intimacy, and even though I often wasn't in the mood, I felt pressured to go along with it for her sake. It got worse to the point where I would say no repeatedly, only to eventually give in after hours of her persistence. I started sleeping with my clothes on and making excuses to avoid seeing her. When I tried to end the relationship, she manipulated my mental health against me, saying things like, "It's just one of your moments, everything is fine," or "You're just afraid you'll hurt me." We both went to the same college, so I saw her all the time, and she continued to guilt me into staying with her. One day, during an argument in the college CAF, she started loudly shouting very personal details of my life, things that cut me deeply. Overwhelmed by anxiety, I screamed that she had hurt me on multiple occasions. She said nothing and ran into the bathroom. I broke down in front of a crowd of our peers, having a panic attack, while everyone just stared. The incident was reported to the college, and I was suspended for a month. Even though I talked to the police about it, my college pressured me into not pursuing the case further. Most of the faculty still see me in a negative light because of that incident, and only my closest friends have stood by me through it all. Story 21. This story involves more coercion than outright force. It was with a friend from college whom I reconnected with a couple of years after we graduated. She had crossed boundaries before, which is why I had distanced myself from her. I once woke up to find her in my bed in her underwear when she was supposed to be sleeping downstairs. When we reconnected, I tried to give her another chance because I was feeling lonely and didn't have many reliable friends at the time. One night, we were at my apartment drinking together, or at least I thought we were. The next morning, I realized her glass was still full, while I had nearly finished a whole bottle of wine by myself. She started kissing me, and even though I wasn't really into her, I let it continue because I was lonely and thought maybe this was okay. She kept asking to take things further, and I said no multiple times, but she kept pushing until I eventually gave in. The next day, I felt uneasy, but I couldn't figure out why until I talked to a friend who told me that what had happened sounded like coercion. It took me a long time to come to terms with it, especially since it didn't feel as violent or clear-cut as other experiences. But I eventually realized that the only reason I went along with it was because I felt like I didn't have a choice. What made it even harder to process was that I had previously been through a traumatic experience when I was 15, so to have something like this happen again in my own space was difficult to deal with. I'm still working through it in therapy years later.